The wilderness, it's beautiful, vast, and unforgiving. But when the sun goes down and the silence grows heavy, the forest hides more than just shadows. Out there, miles from help, strange things happen. Things you can't explain, things you'll never forget. Tonight, we dive into Three Bone, chilling true wilderness horror stories that will make you think twice before stepping off the trail. The air was crisp and sharp with the scent of pine needles, the kind of freshness that city lungs weren't used to breathing. Mark adjusted the straps of his backpack as he stepped onto the narrow trail that wound its way deeper into the forest. He had always loved hiking, but this trip was different. Longer, more isolated, and far from the usual well-trodden paths. He wanted to push himself, to feel the thrill of survival in the wilderness with nothing but a map, his gear, and his own instincts. The forest loomed tall around him, its towering trees blotting out much of the sky, leaving streaks of light that danced along the undergrowth. For a while it felt peaceful, almost hypnotic, as though he were walking into a world untouched by time. The deeper he ventured, the more the sounds of civilization faded away. Birds chirped above him, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at small creatures scurrying out of sight. Mark smiled at the solitude, at the quiet power of being alone in nature. He stopped to drink water and glanced at his map. According to his plan, he'd set up camp by a ridge before nightfall, giving him enough daylight to prepare a fire and settle in. The forest seemed ordinary, even welcoming, but there was something about the density of the trees that made him feel as though he were being swallowed whole. He pushed that thought aside, reminding himself that he had been in forests before, though never this deep, never this isolated. By mid-afternoon, the trail grew narrower, the ground damp from a stream nearby. He crouched down to refill his bottle, watching the water flow with a strange kind of stillness despite its current. It was then he thought he heard something faint, a voice, or maybe just the wind slipping between the branches. He paused listening, but only the water and the distant call of a crow reached his ears. Shaking it off, he climbed back onto the path and continued forward, his boots crunching softly over fallen leaves. As the sun began to dip lower, shadows lengthened across the ground, and the forest began to change. The birds grew quieter, the air colder. Mark noticed the silence first, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but heavy, pressing down on him like a weight. He told himself it was just nature's way of shifting into night, yet the feeling in his chest told him something else. He moved faster, determined to find the ridge, but the trail twisted in ways that didn't quite match his map. He frowned, unfolded it again, and tried to realign his position, but the landmarks he expected weren't there. No ridge, no distinct bend in the river, only trees upon trees standing like silent sentinels. Mark kept walking, certain he would eventually reach his destination, but unease crept in with every step. The forest no longer felt inviting. It felt watchful. Every creak of a branch, every snap of a twig seemed amplified in the encroaching darkness, as though the wilderness itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to notice that he was no longer entirely alone. The night had been restless, with Mark waking several times to the rustling of leaves and the uneasy sensation of being exposed, even inside his tent. When dawn finally broke, he felt relief at the light filtering through the canopy, though the forest around him seemed unchanged, still vast, still indifferent, still carrying that strange weight in the silence. After a quick breakfast, he packed up and pressed further into the wilderness, determined to find his way back on track. The map offered him little comfort now, as landmarks refused to match what his eyes saw, but he convinced himself that he would eventually stumble upon the ridge he had been searching for. Hours passed before he noticed something that made his skin prickle. Just off the path, tucked between a thick stand of pines, was a clearing. Curiosity tugged at him, though a knot formed in his stomach. He stepped carefully through the undergrowth until the sight came into view, a campsite. At first, relief flooded through him. Someone else had been out here, maybe recently. The thought of human presence felt grounding, a reminder that he wasn't entirely lost in this labyrinth of trees. But as he stepped closer, that relief began to sour into unease. The campsite was old, but not old enough to be forgotten by time. A small fire pit sat in the center, filled with ash that had long cooled, yet still seemed oddly undisturbed by rain or wind. Scattered around were remnants of gear, a torn sleeping bag, a dented pot, a boot with its laces frayed. Mark crouched down, studying the items. The strangest part was that nothing appeared properly abandoned. It didn't look like someone had packed up and left. It looked like someone had simply walked away, mid-use, leaving everything as it was. He noticed claw-like marks etched into the trunk of a nearby tree, long and deep, far too high to have been made by an ordinary animal. He touched the grooves, his fingers fitting into the ridges, and a chill ran through him. The thought of a bear crossed his mind, but the pattern didn't match. They were deliberate, almost purposeful, as if made to send a message rather than mark territory. His eyes darted back to the campsite, and suddenly the silence of the forest felt unbearable. He couldn't even hear birds anymore, not a single rustle of wildlife. Mark's instincts screamed at him to leave, yet something kept him rooted. He examined the ground and found footprints, several overlapping, circling the site in confusing patterns. Some seemed human though bare, as if someone had walked without shoes. Others were harder to place, their shapes strange, distorted, not quite belonging to any creature he could recognize. He followed one set a few feet before stopping, realizing they disappeared into the forest only to reappear in the opposite direction, as though someone had been pacing around the clearing endlessly. A strange smell lingered in the air, faint but noticeable. It wasn't rot exactly, nor the musk of an animal, but something metallic, sharp, like the tang of blood carried faintly on the wind. Mark backed away from the fire pit, his eyes sweeping the trees that encircled the clearing. The feeling of being watched, so strong the night before, returned with greater force, and now it seemed to press in from every angle. The campsite, once a sign of hope, now felt like a warning, a scar left behind by something that was never meant to be found. As dusk began to settle over the forest, Mark felt the creeping unease in his bones grow heavier. The discovery of the abandoned campsite gnawed at his thoughts, replaying in fragments every time he glanced into the shadowed trees. He had forced himself to walk away, to keep moving, telling himself that the farther he put that strange clearing behind him, the safer he would feel. But the forest had other plans. The trail seemed to dissolve into nothingness, wending him deeper into unfamiliar territory. He tried to reassure himself by focusing on his steps, but the silence pressed in closer with every mile. By the time he chose a spot to set up camp, the last light of day was bleeding away into streaks of gray. He cleared an area, pitched his tent, and struck a match to start a small fire. The flame sputtered, caught, and gave off a fragile glow, the only comfort against the encroaching dark. Yet even with the fire, Mark couldn't shake the sensation that he was not alone. His eyes kept drifting to the trees just beyond the ring of light, where shadows seemed to cluster unnaturally thick. Every so often, he thought he caught the faintest flicker of movement, as though something was shifting between the trunks, careful not to be seen directly. He told himself it was just his nerves, exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. After all, long hikes could wear anyone down, and fear had a way of magnifying the ordinary into something sinister. But when the first whisper reached his ears, a chill bolted through him. It was faint, so faint he thought at first it was the wind brushing through the branches. Then it came again, closer this time, soft and deliberate, carrying a tone that almost resembled speech, though no words could be made out. Mark froze, staring into the trees, his breath caught in his throat. The forest around him seemed to lean closer, listening. The fire popped, but its warmth did nothing to thaw the cold crawling up his spine. The whispers came again, multiple strands weaving together, circling him. He spun, his eyes darting into the dark, but no figure revealed itself. Only the trees, tall and silent, their bark glinting faintly in the firelight. He shouted into the night, his voice shaky, demanding whoever was there to come out. His words dissolved into the quiet, swallowed whole by the vastness around him. Hours dragged on, and Mark sat rigid by the fire, unable to bring himself to retreat into the tent. Every sound became suspect. The snap of a twig, the flutter of unseen wings, the shifting of branches overhead. The whispers continued, not constant, but returning in waves, sometimes so near he swore they were just behind him, other times drifting as if carried from far away. He began to wonder if he was losing his mind, if the forest was playing tricks, feeding on his fear and twisting it into sound. But deep down, he knew what he felt was real. The sensation of being observed, studied, lingered like a predator's gaze, unrelenting and patient, waiting for him to let his guard slip. The fire had burned low, its glow reduced to a faint pulse of orange, when Mark finally forced himself into his tent. He zipped it shut with trembling hands, the thin fabric feeling like the only barrier between him and the suffocating darkness outside. Inside, the air was stuffy, carrying the faint scent of earth and damp nylon. He laid down on his sleeping bag, every muscle tense, straining to hear beyond the canvas walls. At first there was only the crackle of the dying fire, but then the forest came alive again, not with birds or insects, but with sounds that didn't belong. A slow, dragging step across the leaves. a branch snapping under deliberate weight, the unmistakable rhythm of something moving with intent. Mark held his breath, trying not to make a sound, his ears tuning to every shift outside. The footsteps circled, slow and methodical, pausing now, and then as though whatever was out there was listening back. He swallowed hard, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain it could be heard. He wanted to convince himself it was an animal, maybe a deer or even a bear, but the pacing was too steady, too controlled, too human. He reached for the knife he kept in his pack and clutched it tightly, the cold steel grounding him as fear threatened to unravel his thoughts. A low rustle brushed against the tent wall, so close he could feel the faintest ripple as the fabric shifted inward. His breath caught in his throat. Something was touching his shelter, testing its fragility. He imagined a hand pressing against the thin barrier, fingers tracing the outline of where he lay frozen. He didn't dare move. The sound lingered, dragging along the side of the tent, before retreating back into the silence of the trees. Minutes crawled by like hours. Then came the whisper again, clearer than before, a hushed murmur just beyond the tent flap. He couldn't make out words, but the cadence was unmistakably intentional. It rose and fell in rhythm, like someone speaking in a language he wasn't meant to understand. The sound wrapped around him, seeping into the thin walls of the tent, until it felt as if the voice was inside with him. His grip on the knife tightened, his knuckles white. He wanted to scream, to tear through the flap and confront whatever was out there, but terror anchored him to the ground. Suddenly, a loud snap shattered the air, a branch breaking under a heavy weight. Then silence. Mark's body quaked as he listened, but nothing followed. The night fell still again, heavy and oppressive, the whispers gone, the footsteps vanished. For a moment he thought he had been spared, that maybe it was over. But as he lay there, staring at the faint glow of cooling embers through the thin fabric, he realized the silence wasn't comforting. It was waiting, a pause before something else returned. The forest felt like it was holding its breath along with him, as though both man and wilderness were suspended in the same uneasy anticipation of what would come next. The morning light blood weakly through the trees, painting the forest floor in streaks of gray. Mark unzipped his tent with shaking hands, half expecting to find something waiting just outside. The clearing was empty, but the sense of unease clung to the air like fog. The fire had burned out completely during the night, leaving behind only a circle of cold ash. He stepped out, every movement stiff, his body sore from a night spent frozen with tension. The silence of the woods had not lifted with the dawn. Instead, it seemed heavier, as though the forest itself had woken with him and was watching closely to see what he would do next. He tried to shake off the dread by focusing on practical matters. He packed his gear, slung his backpack over his shoulders, and set off in search of a way back toward familiar ground. Each step felt loud against the muted quiet, every crunch of leaves beneath his boots amplified until he found himself wincing at the sound. He kept glancing over his shoulder, expecting movement, but the forest remained still. The map he carried had become useless, a crumpled sheet that no longer matched the terrain around him. Every ridge looked the same, every tree another sentinel in an endless maze. After hours of walking, he came across something that stopped him cold. Between the trees, hanging from a branch, was a strip of fabric fluttering gently in the breeze. It was weathered, stained with dirt, but clearly once part of a shirt or jacket. He reached for it, his stomach twisting as his fingers brushed against the rough cloth. It hadn't been there long. Its edges weren't frayed by time, and the knot securing it to the branch was deliberate. It looked less like something left behind and more like a marker, as though someone, or something, wanted it to be seen. His pulse quickened as he noticed more signs along the way. A stack of rocks arranged carefully at the base of a tree. A length of rope tangled high in the branches, where no one could have easily placed it. A circle carved into the bark of an old oak, the lines uneven and jagged. Each discovery carried the same unsettling implication: these weren't accidents, and they weren't natural. Someone had been here, leaving a trail, but the intent behind it was impossible to understand. As the day dragged on, the forest began to feel smaller, the trees closing in tighter with each step. The air grew damp, heavy, and Mark swore the light was dimming far earlier than it should have. He felt eyes on him constantly now, an invisible presence trailing just beyond his sight. He began to move faster, his breathing shallow, his eyes darting at every flicker of shadow. When he finally stumbled into another small clearing, his relief was short-lived. In the center lay a fire pit nearly identical to the one he had seen before, but fresher, as though it had been abandoned only hours ago. The ash inside was still dark, The wood blackened but not yet crumbled. Mark froze, realizing with a sinking dread that he was not retracing his steps, but being led in circles. Drawn deeper into a place that refused to let him leave, Mark's legs felt heavier with every step, his throat dry from hours of silence broken only by the crunch of leaves and the occasional rasp of his breath. The second campsite had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit, its freshness confirming what his instincts already screamed, that he was not alone, and that someone else had been moving through these woods, leaving just enough evidence to remind him of their presence. He tried to force his mind into rational explanations. Perhaps hunters. Perhaps hikers who had come before him and simply vanished without proper cleanup. But deep inside, he knew that what he was seeing didn't feel accidental. Each sign seemed arranged with purpose, as though it were part of some hidden game. The forest around him grew denser, the canopy overhead blotting out much of the afternoon sun. The shadows stretched longer, curling into shapes that teased the corners of his vision. He quickened his pace, fighting the growing paranoia, but the feeling of being followed gnawed at him without pause. Every time he looked back, the trail was empty, yet the quiet refused to settle naturally. The stillness was too complete, the silence rehearsed, as if something unseen slipped out of view the instant his eyes turned. Eventually, exhaustion forced him to stop. He sank onto a fallen log, trying to steady his hands as he pulled out his water bottle. The sound of liquid sloshing inside gave him fleeting comfort, but then he froze mid-sip. Somewhere in the trees, faint but unmistakable, came the echo of another breath. It wasn't the rustle of leaves or the groan of wood in the wind. It was human, ragged and controlled, almost as if whoever was making it was trying not to be heard. Mark snapped his head in the direction of the sound, his heart punching against his ribs, but the forest stood empty, as silent as before. He stayed perfectly still, knife at the ready, eyes scanning the thick tangle of branches. Nothing moved. The breath came again, closer this time, and then vanished altogether, leaving only the pounding of his pulse. He stood abruptly, deciding to keep moving no matter the fatigue dragging at his body. He couldn't stay in one place, not when something was stalking him with such patience. As twilight began to settle, the woods seemed to shift again, becoming a labyrinth of indistinguishable paths. He tried marking his way by snapping branches or leaving small items, but each time he looked back, the signs seemed to fade, swallowed by the wilderness. Once, he found one of his own snapped branches carefully propped back into place, as though mocking his attempts to navigate. The realization chilled him. He wasn't just being followed, he was being guided. Each step he took deeper into the forest was not random wandering, but part of a path someone else had already chosen for him. The weight of that thought pressed down harder than the darkness itself, and Mark began to wonder not if he would find his way out, but what he was being led toward. Night returned with a suffocating swiftness, the last slivers of daylight slipping away, until the forest was drowned in shadow. Mark moved with hurried steps, his flashlight trembling in his grip as its narrow beam pierced only a fraction of the darkness. Each flicker of light revealed trunks that seemed to stretch endlessly upward, their branches clawing at the sky, their shadows twisting unnaturally across the forest floor. He tried to keep calm, but every sound seemed amplified in the still air. The crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, even his own ragged breathing felt like it carried for miles. The sensation of being pursued had grown unbearable, no longer a fleeting paranoia, but a steady certainty gnawing at him with every step. He stopped in his tracks when the beam of his light fell upon something that didn't belong. Hanging from a low branch just ahead was another strip of fabric, but this one was darker, stiff as though stained with something more than dirt. The knot was tied too tightly, the edges frayed as if torn rather than cut. His stomach churned as he reached toward it, but before his fingers touched the cloth, a sound cracked the silence, a slow, deliberate footstep somewhere behind him. He spun, the flashlight beam jerking wildly, illuminating nothing but the vast, oppressive trees. The step came again, off to the side this time, closer, and then the forest fell silent once more. Mark backed away, the beam of light darting frantically, until his heel struck something solid. He turned and felt his breath catch. There, in the center of a small clearing, stood a crude structure. Branches lashed together into the rough shape of a shelter, half collapsed, as if hastily abandoned. Inside lay remnants of possessions, a rusted canteen, a torn backpack, scraps of clothing scattered across the dirt. The objects were weathered but not ancient, and each carried an eerie weight, as though their owners had vanished mid-breath. His flashlight swept across the scene, and for the briefest instant, He thought he saw the outline of a figure crouched in the corner of the shelter. But when he blinked, there was nothing. A low whisper drifted through the trees, carried on no breeze, the same unintelligible cadence that had haunted him before. This time it was clearer, closer, curling around him in waves. He staggered back, his pulse racing, and nearly dropped the flashlight as its beam wavered. The whisper grew louder, multiplying into layers of sound, some deep, some high-pitched, all weaving together until it felt like a chorus encircling him. His hands shook violently as he shouted into the void, demanding it stop, but the voices only twisted into laughter, mocking and cruel, echoing through the trees. The flashlight flickered, its beam sputtering before returning weakly. In that brief flicker of darkness, Mark was certain he had seen movement, several shapes, standing just beyond the clearing, watching him with motionless patience. The light steadied again, but the figures were gone, leaving only the suffocating silence in their place. His chest tightened as he realized that whatever was out there was no longer trying to stay hidden, that the forest itself seemed to be closing around him, funneling him deeper into something he could neither escape nor understand. Mark staggered forward, his body driven more by fear than strength, each step feeling heavier than the last. The voices had gone quiet, but their absence was more disturbing than their presence, as though they had simply retreated into the trees to watch him in silence. The forest was darker now than the night before. The moon choked behind a dense curtain of clouds, leaving him with only the narrow glow of his flashlight to carve out a path. Every sweep of the beam revealed fragments of the woods that looked both familiar and alien, as if the forest itself had rearranged while he wasn't looking. The same twisted branches and moss-covered stones appeared again and again, trapping him in an endless cycle of repetition that blurred his sense of direction. His legs buckled as he reached a hollow where the ground dipped. At its center lay something that froze his breath, a circle of stones arranged deliberately, inside of which ashes and charred bones rested, their pale fragments gleaming faintly under the light. The remains were unmistakably human, too large and too distinct to be mistaken for an animal. Mark staggered back, bile rising in his throat, the realization crashing down that whoever had been stalking him wasn't just toying with him. They had claimed others before. The ground around the circle bore impressions, uneven and scattered, as though several people had once stood there. His light caught more symbols carved crudely into nearby trees, spirals and jagged shapes that seemed to pulse when stared at too long, filling him with a sickening sense of recognition that he couldn't explain. A sudden noise cut through the heavy air, a dragging scrape, like something heavy being pulled across leaves. He swung the flashlight wildly, its beam trembling as it bounced from trunk to trunk, until it caught on something pale. For a heartbeat he thought it was another bone, but then it shifted. A hand, human, gray and stiff with decay, slipped back into the shadows, leaving only the memory of its shape behind. Mark's breath hitched as his legs instinctively pushed him backward, the beam jerking wildly across the hollow. For a moment he thought he saw faces peering from behind the trees, hollow-eyed and expressionless, only to vanish when he tried to focus. He turned and ran, his boots pounding against the uneven ground, every ounce of reason drowned out by instinct. Branches lashed at his arms, cutting into his skin, but he didn't dare stop. The forest responded with noises of its own, the crash of something moving parallel to him, the crack of heavy footsteps closing the gap, and the return of the whispers, rising again in a maddening chorus. His chest heaved as he pushed himself harder, his mind fracturing under the sensation that no matter how far he ran, the forest was bending, redirecting him, ensuring that escape was never an option. When he stumbled into another clearing, his knees nearly gave way. At its center was a tree thicker than any he had ever seen, its bark stripped bare and its surface carved with countless overlapping symbols, the same spirals and jagged marks as before, etched so deep the wood seemed to bleed darkness. The sight struck him with such force that he could no longer deny it. He wasn't lost by accident. He had been led here deliberately, to the heart of something that had been waiting for him all along. The tree loomed above him like a monolith, its scarred surface etched with markings that seemed to wreathe when his flashlight beam lingered too long. Mark's breath came in shallow bursts as he circled it, his boots sinking into the damp soil littered with fragments of bone and ash. The carvings weren't random. They spiraled upward in overlapping patterns, some resembling twisted symbols, others stretching into crude shapes that looked almost like faces frozen mid-scream. He tried to steady himself, tried to believe they were nothing more than vandalism by someone disturbed, but deep down he knew the patterns carried a weight, a rhythm, something that pulsed with intent. A low sound rose from somewhere within the forest, not quite a growl and not quite a moan, vibrating through the air until his chest ached with the pressure. He staggered back, his light jerking upward, and for the briefest instant he thought he saw movement at the top of the tree. Something hunched against the bark, its limbs too long, its body pressed close as if blending with the wood. When the beam returned, the shape was gone, leaving only shadows dancing across the gouged symbols. He wanted to flee, but his legs refused, locked by the pull of the tree and whatever it represented. The silence broke with a sudden rush of footsteps, quick and deliberate, circling him just beyond the edge of the light. Mark spun frantically, his knife drawn, his breath fogging in the cold air. The steps never drew closer, never retreated, only paced in steady loops that tightened his chest until he thought it might split. He shouted into the dark, his voice cracking, demanding whoever was out there to show themselves. The only answer was laughter, thin, distorted, weaving through the trees as if carried by more than one voice at once. It grew louder until it seemed to come from every direction, pressing in on him like a tightening cage. His flashlight flickered and for a heartbeat plunged him into blackness. In that void, he felt something brush against his arm, cold, rough, and gone in an instant. The light snapped back on, and he saw impressions in the soil around him, human, like footprints that hadn't been there seconds before. They formed a ring, encircling him, trapping him in place. His panic surged, but before he could move, the laughter fell silent, replaced by a single whisper that threaded directly into his ear. He whipped around, but the forest was empty, the trees standing still and unbroken. The oppressive quiet returned, but now it was worse, expectant, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Mark turned toward the path behind him only to find it gone, replaced by a wall of tangled branches and roots that hadn't been there before. Every direction looked the same, twisted and shifting, as though the woods were rearranging to keep him bound to this place. His light caught on something new at the base of the tree. A crude figure assembled from bones, bound together with rope and cloth, its hollow sockets staring directly at him. The realization struck with merciless clarity that he was not simply lost, he was being prepared. Drawn step by step toward a conclusion, he no longer had the strength to resist. Mark stood frozen before the crude figure, its bony frame tied together with weathered strips of cloth, its hollow sockets reflecting the beam of his faltering flashlight. The forest had grown impossibly still, not even the whisper of wind through the branches, as though every living thing was holding its breath, waiting for him to make his move. His instincts screamed at him to run, but the path was gone, swallowed by the twisted labyrinth of roots and trees. The symbols carved into the massive trunk seemed to pulse faintly, alive with an energy he could almost hear, a low hum threading through his skull until his vision blurred at the edges. He staggered closer, compelled by something he couldn't name, his feet moving without his command. The bone figure seemed taller now, looming as though it had grown from the earth itself, its limbs stretching outward, its head tilted in silent judgment. The whispers returned, layered and relentless, pressing into his ears until he couldn't tell if they were outside or inside his head. Words formed, not in a language he understood, but he felt their meaning nonetheless. He had been chosen, he had been led, he had been claimed. Mark raised his knife, his hand trembling, determined to shatter the figure and whatever it represented. But before the blade could strike, a sharp crack echoed through the clearing. The ground beneath him shifted as if rejecting his defiance. The earth split in narrow veins around the roots of the tree, glowing faintly as if fire burned beneath the soil. He fell to his knees, the knife slipping from his grip, his body racked with cold despite the heat seeping from below. When he looked up, the figure was no longer just bones. It had flesh, sinew, a form taking shape from the darkness itself. The hollow eyes flared with a pale light that fixed on him unblinking, eternal. The last thing Mark felt was not pain but surrender, as if the forest itself was folding him into its fabric, erasing his identity and replacing it with something older, something it had been waiting centuries to awaken. His scream caught in his throat, swallowed by the trees, until there was nothing left of him but silence. The clearing stood empty, the knife buried half in the dirt, the symbols on the trunk glowing faintly before dimming once more. The figure of bones had vanished, leaving only scattered fragments and the faint hum of the forest settling back into its patient stillness. Days later, hikers passing through the outer edges of the forest reported hearing distant voices, strange patterns carved into bark, and the uneasy feeling of being followed. Some swore they glimpsed a figure deeper in the woods, tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. None dared venture far enough to confirm what they saw. The wilderness had claimed another, and like those before him, Mark had become part of the story that would continue to draw the curious, the brave, and the doomed. Thank you for listening, friends. If you enjoyed this terrifying journey into the unknown, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support means everything, and it allows me to bring you more spine-chilling true horror stories. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't in your imagination, but waiting just beyond the trees.